In 2001, a group of activists in the United States launched an unusual proposal. They asked 20,000 libertarians to move to a single state, New Hampshire, to transform its government from within. Reduce taxes to the minimum. Eliminate regulations. Turn an entire state into an experiment in radical freedom. It was called the Free State Project. More than 20,000 people signed up. Thousands actually moved. The result? Some towns eliminated nearly all public services. Bears began invading the streets because nobody was managing the garbage. Town hall meetings turned into battlefields. Coexistence got complicated. This is not an anecdote meant to ridicule. It is an illustration of what happens when extreme ideas about the state meet reality. And today we are going to explore those ideas seriously, because they contain questions that deserve answers even if the answers are difficult. So far in this season we have seen ideologies that occupy most of the spectrum. Capitalism and liberalism on one side. Socialism and communism on the other. The welfare state in the center. Neoliberalism pushing toward less state. But there are thinkers who go further than any of these. Who question the very existence of the state as a legitimate institution. And they do so from the right and from the left. What they have in common is a radical distrust of concentrated power. What separates them is almost everything else. The most moderate starting point on this spectrum is minarchism. The idea that the state should exist, but do only what is strictly necessary, protect citizens from violence, enforce contracts, and little else. Robert Nozick articulated this position with philosophical rigor in 1974 with his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. His argument was that people have natural rights, especially the right to property, that the state cannot violate without consent. Taxes to fund services beyond basic protection amount, according to Nozick, to forced labor, the state compels you to work part of your day to finance things you did not choose. Nozick's minimal state would provide police, courts, defense, and nothing else. Education, healthcare, pensions, roads, everything else would be private, funded by those who voluntarily chose to pay for it. The most immediate criticism is practical. In real history, no minimal state has survived without expanding. Democracies tend to vote for more public services, not fewer. Citizens themselves demand social protection. The minimal state may be philosophically coherent, but it is politically unstable. The deeper criticism is moral. If police and courts protect property, and property is distributed extremely unequally, the minimal state protects an order that benefits some far more than others. Nozick argued that inequality is legitimate if it arises from voluntary exchanges. His critics respond that the initial distribution of property was never fair, so subsequent exchanges inherit that injustice. Murray Rothbard took the argument further. If the minimal state is still a state, and every state depends on coercion, the only coherent position is to eliminate the state entirely. Rothbard's anarcho-capitalism proposes that all services currently provided by the state, including police, courts, and national defense, can be supplied by private companies competing in a free market. If you do not like your security company, you hire another one. If you have a dispute with your neighbor, you both go to a private arbitration tribunal. If someone invades your property, your defense insurer responds. The fundamental principle is the non-aggression principle. No one has the right to initiate violence against another person or their property. Every relationship must be voluntary. Every exchange must be consensual. The state, by collecting taxes under threat of imprisonment, systematically violates this principle. The objections are numerous and serious. The most important is the problem of power. Without a state, what prevents the most powerful security companies from becoming de facto states? If an armed company decides it is not in its interest to respect arbitration tribunals, who forces it? Rothbard answered that competition and reputation would be sufficient. Critics, including other libertarians, consider that answer inadequate. The second problem is public goods. There are goods that markets have inherent difficulty providing: national defense, epidemic control, environmental protection. If everyone benefits from clean air but no one can be excluded from breathing it, no individual has an incentive to pay for it. Rothbard rejected this logic, arguing that public goods can be privatized if property rights are well defined. Most economists consider this workable in theory but not in practice. At the opposite end of the libertarian spectrum are left-wing anarchists. They share with anarcho-capitalists the rejection of the state. But they also reject capitalism, which they consider another system of domination. Pyotr Kropotkin, the Russian prince who became an anarchist, published in 1902 Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. Against the social Darwinist idea that nature is pure competition, Kropotkin documented hundreds of examples of cooperation in the animal kingdom and in human societies. His thesis was that voluntary cooperation, not the market and not the state, is the natural basis of social organization. Kropotkin's anarcho-communism envisions self-managed communities where the means of production are held in common, decisions are made by consensus, and distribution is organized according to need. No private ownership of the means of production. No wages. No state to compel. The most ambitious experiment in left-wing anarchism took place during the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, in Catalonia and Aragon, anarchist unions collectivized factories, workshops, and farmland. For months, millions of people lived in a system without state or private property, with mixed results documented by historians. Production was maintained in many factories. Workers' conditions improved in some cases. But coordination problems between collectives were real, and the experiment ended when Francoist forces and Stalinist communists crushed it. The question that left-wing anarchists have never answered satisfactorily is the same one posed to anarcho-capitalists, but in reverse. Without a state and without private property, what prevents an organized group from seizing resources by force and rebuilding a state? History suggests that power vacuums fill quickly. Despite their abysmal differences, these movements share something valuable. They all point to the real dangers of concentrated power. Right-wing libertarians remind us that the state can be as predatory as any corporation. Taxes are not voluntary donations. Regulations can serve the regulated more than the public. Bureaucracies have their own interests. Left-wing anarchists remind us that the market without counterweights generates its own hierarchies. Formal freedom of contract means little when one side holds all the bargaining power. Absolute private property can be as oppressive as the absolute state. Both traditions function as correctives to mainstream thinking. Perhaps not as viable programs of government, but certainly as necessary reminders of the limits and dangers of power, wherever it comes from. For the ordinary person, libertarian and anarchist ideas seem abstract. But their influence seeps into daily life in unexpected ways. Resistance to taxes, distrust of bureaucracy, preference for community solutions over state solutions, these attitudes have libertarian roots, even though those who hold them may never have read Rothbard or Kropotkin. Worker cooperatives, community gardens, local exchange networks, complementary currencies, these experiments have anarchist roots, even though participants may not consider themselves anarchists. The tension between individual freedom and life in society is not a theoretical problem. It is the daily experience of anyone who pays taxes, obeys regulations, contributes to a collective system, and wonders whether that system gives back what they put in. That question has no definitive answer. But asking it is the first step of economic citizenship. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the libertarian spectrum ranges from Nozick's minarchism, which accepts a state reduced to police and courts, to Rothbard's anarcho-capitalism, which wants to eliminate the state entirely and entrust everything to markets. They all share a radical distrust of state power and a defense of individual freedom. Second, left-wing anarchism, from Kropotkin to the collectives of the Spanish Civil War, rejects both the state and capitalism, proposing self-managed communities based on voluntary cooperation. Historical experiments showed it is possible on a small scale, but vulnerable to external pressures and coordination problems. Third, none of these models has been sustained as a large-scale system. But all of them raise legitimate questions about the limits of state power, the failures of bureaucracies, and the alternatives to centralized organization. The libertarian critique of the state and the anarchist critique of property are useful intellectual tools, even if their prescriptions are hard to implement. All the isms we have seen in this season, from capitalism to anarchism, share one premise, that economic growth is desirable. More production, more consumption, more wealth. But what if the planet cannot sustain infinite growth? Next time, the youngest ism of all, ecological economics.